Most people imagine the era of Jesus as a purely spiritual scene. Robes and sandals, sermons and miracles, moral lessons frozen in a distant religious past. But for those actually living in that world, everyday life wasn't shaped by theology alone. It was shaped by money, or more accurately, by the constant absence of it. The world into which the historical figure of Jesus was born existed under one of the most unequal economic systems the ancient Mediterranean had ever produced. Welcome to the financial timeline, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it appears. At the dawn of the 1st century, Judea sat on the outer edge of the Roman Empire, the most efficient wealth extraction machine the world had yet seen. Rome didn't conquer territories to uplift them. It conquered them to feed the center. Provinces existed to funnel value outward. Grain, silver, labor, all moving from the periphery toward Rome itself. Judea was one of those peripheries. And that mattered, because Judea was not rich. It was predominantly rural, agricultural, and economically fragile. Most people survived on small plots of land, not farms designed for profit, but subsistence holdings just large enough to live. A failed harvest didn't mean lower income. It meant starvation, and Rome was indifferent to that reality. Rome ruled Judea through a blend of local elites and imperial officials. Client kings like Herod the Great governed with Roman approval. After his death, Roman prefix figures like Pontius Pilate took direct control. Their role wasn't to improve living conditions. It was to maintain order and keep revenue flowing. Taxes were the backbone of the system. This is where modern assumptions break down. Today, people think of taxes as something tied to income or profit. In Judea, taxes were owed, regardless of outcome. You paid because you existed. Land taxes, crop taxes, head taxes, toll taxes on roads and markets, religious taxes layered on top of imperial ones. Miss a payment, and consequences followed immediately. There was no centralized bureaucracy to appeal to, no legal safety net. Tax collection was outsourced to local contractors, tax farmers, who paid Rome up front for the right to collect and then squeezed the population to recover their costs and generate profit. Exploitation wasn't a malfunction of the system. It was built into the incentive. When people couldn't pay, debt was everywhere. And unlike modern debt, it came with no relief mechanisms. No bankruptcy, no restructuring. Interest accumulated quickly. Land served as collateral. One bad year could trap a family in a spiral they would never escape. The pattern was brutally consistent. A farmer planted crops. Weather turned, the harvest failed. Taxes were still due. The farmer borrowed from a local lender, often a wealthy landowner or someone tied to temple elites. Interest mounted. The next year brought partial recovery, but the debt remained. Eventually, the land was seized. The farmer became a tenant on his former property, or a day laborer, or vanished altogether. This wasn't accidental. It was structural. Over time, land consolidated into fewer and fewer hands. Large estates replaced small holdings. Wealth pooled around elites, aligned with Roman authority and temple administration. The majority slipped deeper into instability. The economy didn't merely produce poverty. It reproduced it. There was no state safety net. Losing land meant losing everything. No unemployment support. No welfare. No public housing. Families were the only buffer. Community charity existed, but it was limited. When too many people fell at once, the system offered nothing. Debt wasn't just economic, it was social. Losing land meant losing status, security, and identity. A family's future could be erased by drought, taxation, or a single missed obligation. This was the world Jesus entered at birth. And it matters to say this plainly. Most people weren't poor because they were lazy, immoral, or cursed. They were poor because the system required them to be. Rome needed surplus. Local elites needed rent. The temple needed revenue. All of that pressure rested on those with the least margin for error. The result was ante just poverty. It was tension. Judea was not peaceful. It was volatile. Rebellions flared regularly. Banditry wasn't merely criminality. It was economic desperation. Groups formed promising justice, relief, reversal. Messianic movements didn't arise in comfort. They arose in collapse. This is where modern audiences often miss the point. When people heard sermons about debt, forgiveness, release, justice, and reversal, they weren't listening to metaphor. They were hearing the language of survival. When the poor were mentioned, it wasn't abstract compassion. It was their neighbors, their families, themselves. Forgiveness, in this context, wasn't just emotional. It meant debt, cancellation, reset, escape. And escape was rare. The Roman system was designed for efficiency, not humanity. It extracted wealth upward with ruthless consistency. It tolerated suffering as long as order remained intact. Stability mattered more than fairness. Revenue mattered more than lives. That's why Judea felt suffocating. People worked harder and fell further behind. Productivity didn't lead to security. Growth didn't lift everyone. It lifted a few and sank the rest. The economy functioned, but it didn't heal. And everyone knew it. There was no illusion of fairness. No belief that effort guaranteed safety. Only endurance, resentment, and the hope that something might break the cycle. That hope is where ideas become dangerous, because in a system this tight, even small changes feel revolutionary. Even words carry threat. By the time Jesus began speaking publicly, economic pressure had reached a breaking point. The audience was ready. The fractures were visible. The desperation was rational. This wasn't background context. It was the engine. To understand why Judea felt so inescapable, you have to examine the institution people believed existed to protect them. The temple. Today, many imagine the temple in Jerusalem as purely religious, a place of prayer and sacrifice. But economically, it was one of the most powerful financial institutions in the region. It didn't just shape belief. It moved money, enormous amounts of money. The temple functioned on multiple levels at once. It was sacred, believed, to house the presence of God, but it also acted as a treasury, a bank, a tax authority, and a court. These roles were inseparable. Every adult Jewish male was required to pay an annual temple tax. It wasn't symbolic, it was enforced. The tax had to be paid in a specific silver coin, the Tyrian shekel, chosen for its consistent silver content. Local currencies weren't accepted. Roman coins weren't accepted. That forced people to exchange money. Money changers facilitated this process for a fee. Pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem for festivals had to convert their currency. Animals for sacrifice were sold at temple-approved prices. Even the poor paid, just in smaller offerings. Religion didn't replace Roman taxation. It was layered on top of it, and here lay the central tension. Temple elites were deeply intertwined with Roman power. High priests weren't selected by popular support or spiritual integrity. They were appointed with Roman approval. Stability outweighed righteousness. Cooperation outweighed justice. So the institution claiming moral authority also benefited from the same extraction logic, impoverishing the population. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. The temple preached holiness, forgiveness, and righteousness, yet reinforced debt, inequality, and exclusion. Access to God required payment. Purity required offerings. Forgiveness required sacrifice, and sacrifice required money. Those without money depended on charity, inconsistent, insufficient, incapable of undoing systemic loss. It treated symptoms, not causes. People noticed. By the 1st century, resentment toward temple authorities was widespread, not because people rejected faith, but because they recognized hypocrisy. The institution meant to mediate between God and the people increasingly resembled another arm of elite control. Jesus didn't speak outside this system. He spoke directly into it. When he spoke of debt forgiveness, people heard economics. When he spoke of release, they heard relief. When he spoke of the poor, they saw themselves, and when he spoke of the kingdom of God, they heard an alternative order, one where the existing system wasn't final. That's why his words carried weight. But words alone don't threaten power. Actions do. Jesus didn't attack Rome head-on. That would have ended quickly. Instead, he undermined legitimacy. He reframed value. He questioned who deserved authority and why. He weakened the moral foundation that sustained both Roman extraction and temple complicity. This is why economic language saturates the teachings. Debt, wages, laborers, vineyards, creditors, stewards, masters, servants. These weren't random metaphors. They reflected daily reality. And then came the act that changed everything. The disruption in the temple. When Jesus overturned the money changers' tables, it wasn't merely religious outrage. It was economic confrontation. He wasn't attacking prayer. He was attacking the machinery that monetized access to the sacred, calling it a den of robbers was anti. A rejection of money itself. It was a condemnation of extraction. Replacing justice, that crossed a line. Rome tolerated prophets, teachers, even critics. What it didn't tolerate was instability. Temple authorities understood that unrest near Passover, when Jerusalem overflowed with pilgrims, was dangerous. Crowds plus grievance meant rebellion. From their perspective, Jesus wasn't just preaching, he was disrupting flows, challenging legitimacy, threatening the balance that preserved their power and satisfied Rome. This is the crucial point. The conflict wasn't primarily theological. It was economic and political. The system could survive inequality. It could survive suffering. What it couldn't survive was a narrative that made people question why that suffering existed and whether it was necessary. Once people stop accepting debt as destiny, extraction becomes harder to enforce. Judea was a pressure cooker. Taxes, land loss, debt, religious obligation, and political repression converged. Revolt wasn't a question of if, but when. Rome responded the way it always did. What followed after Jesus wasn't collapse, it was escalation. Within a generation, Judea erupted into full rebellion. In 66 CE, open revolt began. B. 70, Jerusalem was under siege. The temple, the religious, economic, and political heart of Jewish life, was destroyed stone by stone. Its treasury looted, its leadership erased. Hundreds of thousands were killed or displaced. Rome didn't just suppress resistance, it dismantled the infrastructure that made resistance possible and rebuilt control on its own terms. The destruction of the temple didn't end extraction, it streamlined it. Roman taxation intensified. Land consolidation accelerated. Debt persisted, less visible, more bureaucratic, more absolute. Rome won in the short term, decisively and violently. But territorial control isn't the same as control of meaning. Jesus hadn't raised an army. He hadn't proposed tax reform or land redistribution. He wasn't building a rival state. That's precisely why his impact can't be measured by regime change. What he challenged was the moral logic that made extraction feel inevitable, justified, even divine. By rejecting the idea that debt reflected moral failure, by offering forgiveness outside institutional payment, by centering the poor rather than treating them as defective, he destabilized something Rome depended on as much as legions. Legitimacy. Empires can survive suffering. They struggle when people stop believing suffering is the price of order. After the temple fell, the system Jesus critiqued remained, but so did his critique. Small communities formed with different assumptions, shared resources, mutual aid, internal debt relief, loyalty based on belief rather than land or status. These weren't revolutions. They were parallel logics, ways of living inside the empire without belonging to its moral economy. Rome crushed armed rebellion easily, Ethelwise deed. But this kind of challenge was harder to erase. It didn't require territory, temples, or tree suit. It moved with people. It endured pressure. It survived loss. Over time, something unexpected happened. Rome never fully regained control of the story people told about power, debt, and legitimacy. By the 4th century, the empire didn't destroy this alternative framework, it absorbed it. In doing so, it conceded something profound. Authority could no longer rely on force alone. Moral credibility mattered. The economy of Jesus' time reveals an uncomfortable truth. Systems don't collapse simply because they're unjust. They collapse when the stories that justify them stop working. Rome perfected extraction, but it never repaired the moral breach that made its dominance feel natural. And that is the deeper lesson. Economic systems wrapped in moral narratives are extraordinarily durable. They survive resentment. They survive hardship. They even survive rebellion. What they don't survive is widespread disbelief. The moment people stop accepting that suffering is necessary, deserved, or meaningful, history doesn't repeat, but it does expose patterns. And once you see how power defends itself, not just with force, but with stories, it becomes much harder to believe those stories are accidental. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.